Nebraska Sandhills, late October 1886. Nobody noticed what was happening beneath that cabin. From the dirt road cutting through the sandhills, it looked like any other homestead. Rough-cut timber walls, sod roof patched with prairie grass, a single stone chimney leaking wood smoke into the autumn wind. But if you'd stop your wagon and listen closely, you might have heard something strange, the low shuffle of hooves coming from below the floorboards. By the time people realized what Emmett Graves had built, it was already too late to laugh. Because when the blizzard of January 1887 buried the plains under 6 feet of snow and killed livestock across 3 counties, his horses walked out alive, while his neighbors buried theirs in frozen earth. What did this quiet Nebraska homesteader understand about thermal mass and earth shelter that proper builders missed? And why did a design mocked as foolish become the blueprint for survival across the sandhills? If you want to see one frontier hack every week that actually worked when life depended on it, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story proves that the best engineering often looks like madness until winter speaks. Emmett Graves wasn't trying to prove anything. He was a man of few words, 32 years old, with calloused hands and a limp from a logging accident back in Michigan. He'd claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act in the spring of 1884, 2 miles south of a settlement that didn't even have a name yet. Just a post office, a general store, and a dozen families scattered across grassland that rolled like a frozen sea. He had 4 horses, 2 draft animals, a bay gelding named Rust, and a gray mare called Cinder, and 2 lighter saddle horses he used for checking fence lines and riding into town. In that part of Nebraska, horses weren't luxury. They were survival, plow, transportation, and in a bad winter, the difference between eating and starving. But Emmett had learned something brutal in his first 2 winters on the plains. Wooden barns didn't protect animals from cold. They protected them from rain. The wind cut through plank walls like they weren't there. Horses shivered through January nights, burning energy they couldn't afford to lose. And when the temperature dropped below 0 for days at a time, weaker animals just stopped eating, stopped moving, froze standing up. January of 1886, Emmett lost a yearling colt. Found it stiff in the corner of his small timber barn, frost on its eyelashes. The structure had cost him 3 weeks of labor and $60 in milled lumber. It hadn't saved the animal. So that spring, while neighbors repaired their roofs and patched their fences, Emmett did something strange. He started digging. Not a root cellar, not a well. He dug a rectangular pit, 30 feet long and 18 feet wide, right where he planned to build his new cabin. Neighbors riding past slowed their horses, stared, kept riding. Nobody asked. In homestead culture, you didn't question a man's work unless it affected your water or your boundary line. By late summer, the hole was 8 feet deep. Emmett shored the walls with split logs, tamped the floor flat, and cut a sloped ramp into the east side, wide enough for a horse to walk down without hesitation. Then he framed a roof over the top using cottonwood beams and cross planks, and on top of that roof, he built his cabin. The barn was underneath his house. When the first snows came in November, Emmett led Rust, Cinder, and the 2 saddle horses down the ramp and into the earth. He closed a simple plank door behind them, climbed the exterior stairs to his cabin above, and went about his evening, splitting kindling, boiling coffee, reading by lamplight. And below him, in the dark, the horses stood on dry ground, surrounded by 8 feet of soil that hadn't frozen yet. Here's what Emmett understood that most didn't. The earth is a battery. 6 to 8 feet below the surface, soil temperature stays stable year-round, somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude and moisture. It doesn't matter if the air above is 90 in July or negative 30 in January. The ground holds its temperature like a flywheel holds momentum. That consistency is called thermal mass, and Emmett Graves built his entire strategy around it. The underground barn measured roughly 30 feet by 18 feet, with a ceiling height of 7 feet, just tall enough for a horse to stand comfortably, low enough to retain warmth. The walls were a combination of stacked earth and vertical logs, the gaps chinked with clay mixed with grass. The floor was hard-packed dirt, sloped slightly toward the ramp for drainage. Ventilation was deliberate. Two small shafts ran up through the cabin floor above, each about 4 inches in diameter, capped with simple wooden covers Emmett could slide open or closed. When the horses were inside, he cracked the vents just enough to let stale air escape and fresh air trickle in. Never enough to create a draft, just enough to prevent suffocation. The roof, which doubled as the floor of Emmett's cabin, was built from cottonwood beams spaced 16 inches apart, covered with smaller cross planks, then a layer of clay, then sod. It was airtight, load-bearing, and critically, it allowed heat from the cabin's wood stove to radiate downward into the barn. Not much heat, just residual warmth. But in a space insulated by 8 feet of earth on all sides, even a few degrees mattered. Emmett didn't need to keep the barn at 70 degrees. He just needed to keep it above freezing. And the earth, combined with the animal's own body heat and the faint warmth bleeding down from above, did exactly that. The design had other advantages. Because the barn was buried, it was invisible to wind. On the open plains, where January gusts could hit 60 miles per hour, that mattered. A wooden barn acted like a sail, funneling cold air through every crack. Emmett's barn had no cracks. The only opening was the ramp door, which faced east, away from the prevailing northwest wind. The ramp itself was clever. It descended at a gentle slope, wide enough for a horse to walk confidently, with low earth walls on both sides to prevent stumbling. In heavy snow, Emmett could shovel the ramp clear in 10 minutes. A conventional barn door, by contrast, could be blocked for days. And if the worst happened, if a blizzard buried the ramp entirely, Emmett had a backup. He'd built a small trapdoor in the cabin floor, directly above the barn. In an emergency, he could drop hay and water down to the horses without ever stepping outside. It was a system designed not for comfort, but for reliability under crisis. When neighbors saw it finished, they didn't say much. A few muttered jokes. One older farmer, a man named Caleb Rourke who'd been in Nebraska since the 1870s, shook his head and said, "Horses don't live underground, Emmett. You've built yourself a tomb." Emmett just nodded and kept stacking firewood. The ridicule wasn't loud. It wasn't organized. It was just there. People didn't understand what Emmett had built, so they made it into a joke. That's what people do. Graves put his horses in a hole. Man's living on top of a barn like some kind of prairie badger. Bet it floods first hard rain. Gonna drown those animals in mud. The comments came casual over coffee at the general store, during Sunday gatherings at the schoolhouse that doubled as a church. Nobody was angry. Nobody thought Emmett was dangerous or defying God. They just thought he was odd, wasting effort on something that didn't make sense. A traveling carpenter passing through in late November stopped by Emmett's place to water his horses. He looked at the setup, the low-profile cabin, the ramp descending into the earth, the lack of a separate barn structure, and laughed. "You do know horses ain't moles, right?" Emmett filled the man's canteen from his well and said nothing. The carpenter kept going. "I've built barns from Ohio to Kansas. Never seen a man bury livestock on purpose. What happens when it rains? What happens when you need to get in there fast?" Emmett handed back the canteen. "Ramp drains fine. Horses walk in and out same as any barn." The carpenter shook his head, still grinning. "Well, it's your stock. Just seems like a lot of digging for nothing." He rode off, and Emmett went back to splitting wood. The thing is, nobody cared enough to stop him. That's the difference between mockery and opposition. If Emmett had been blocking a road or damming a creek, people would have intervened. But this was just Emmett being Emmett, a quiet man doing something strange on his own land. Let him waste his time. Caleb Rourke, the older farmer, was the closest thing to a voice of authority. He'd survived the grasshopper plagues, the droughts, the killing winters. People listened when he talked. And one evening in December, sitting around a stove in the general store, someone asked him what he thought of Graves' underground barn. Caleb sipped his coffee, stared into the wood stove, and said, "Emmett's a hard worker. But that setup's a mistake. You bury animals, you trap moisture. Moisture turns to ice. Ice kills faster than wind. Come February, he'll be digging frozen horses out of that hole." A few men nodded. That made sense. That sounded like experience talking. And so the consensus formed. not with hostility, but with certainty. Emmett Graves had built something foolish. It might work in autumn. It wouldn't work in a real winter. They were wrong, but they wouldn't know that until January. It started on the morning of January 12th. The sky went the color of old iron. The wind shifted northwest, picking up speed, and the temperature, already near zero, began to fall. By noon, the first snow arrived. Not flakes, pellets. Hard, wind-driven ice that stung exposed skin and piled into drifts within minutes. Emmett saw it coming. Every homesteader did. You learned to read weather, or you didn't last. He brought the horses down into the barn early, while he could still see the ramp. He filled their trough with water from the well, forked down extra hay, checked the ventilation shafts, and sealed the ramp door with a crossbar and a wool blanket nailed across the gaps. Then he climbed back to the cabin, shut the door, and fed the wood stove. By evening, the wind was screaming. This wasn't a normal plains blizzard. This was the storm people would talk about for decades, the one that killed hundreds of cattle, collapsed barns, froze entire herds in open pasture. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Winds hit 70 miles per hour. The snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, building drifts 15 feet high against anything that stood upright. Visibility dropped to zero. You couldn't see your own fence line. Homesteaders tied ropes between their houses and their barns so they wouldn't get lost in the 50 feet between them. Some did anyway. Froze to death 10 yards from their own doors. The storm lasted 72 hours. In conventional wooden barns across the sandhills, animals suffered. The wind found every gap, every knothole, every warped board. It didn't matter how much hay you piled or how thick the walls were. Cold air moved, and it moved fast. Horses shivered, burned calories they didn't have, and weakened. Some died of exposure. Others died of exhaustion, their bodies just giving up. Caleb Rourke lost 2 horses and a milk cow. The Jensens, a family 3 miles west, lost 5 head of cattle. The Pritchards lost everything. Their entire herd froze in a lean-to that collapsed under snow weight. And Emmett? Emmett sat by his wood stove, boiled coffee, read a Bible he didn't believe in, and listened to the wind howl over his roof. Below him, in the dark, the horses stood quiet. The barn temperature hovered near 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth around them, 8 feet of soil that hadn't frozen since October, held steady. The ventilation shafts stayed clear. Emmett checked them twice a day, sweeping snow away from the caps. Warm air from the cabin seeped down through the floorboards. Not much, but enough to keep the space breathable and above freezing. The horses didn't shiver. They ate hay. They drank water that hadn't turned to ice. They shifted weight from hoof to hoof, calm, because nothing in their environment screamed danger. On the 3rd day, the wind stopped. The silence was eerie. Emmett opened his cabin door and stepped into a world buried under snow. Drifts higher than his head. The horizon glittering white under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. He dug out the ramp, took him 4 hours with a shovel, and opened the barn door. All 4 horses walked out, blinking in the light, breath steaming, alive. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Emmett right. It changed how people built in the sandhills for the next 40 years. Caleb Rourke was the first to arrive. He came on the 4th day after the storm, riding a half-starved mare through snow that came up to her chest. He'd lost 2 horses, good animals, strong breeding stock, and he was making rounds to see how the other homesteaders had fared, checking who was alive, who needed help, who had animals left to trade or sell. When he crested the low hill overlooking Emmett's place, he expected to find disaster. What he saw instead stopped him cold. 4 horses stood in Emmett's yard, nosing through snow to reach the dead grass beneath. Their coats were thick, glossy, no visible ribs, no shivering. They looked like they'd spent the last 3 days in a heated stable, not buried under the worst blizzard in Nebraska memory. Caleb dismounted, walked closer. Emmett was shoveling snow away from his well, methodical, calm. He looked up, nodded. "Caleb." "Emmett." Caleb's voice was flat. He stared at the horses. "These the same 4 you had before the storm?" "They are." "Where do you keep him?" Emmett pointed down, toward the ground beneath his cabin. "Same place I've been keeping him. Down below." Caleb walked to the ramp entrance. Now, cleared of snow and descended slowly. The air inside was still, not warm, but not freezing either. He could see his breath, but faintly. The walls were dry. The floor was dry. There was no ice, no frost on the beams, no dead animal smell. He stood there for a long moment, then climbed back up. What was the temperature in there? Emmett shrugged. Didn't measure exact. But the water trough never froze. Horses never shivered. Felt about like a root cellar in November. Caleb did the math in his head. Root cellars in November ran somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees. Outside, during the storm, it had been 40 below. That was a difference of nearly 90 degrees. He looked at Emmett. You telling me the hole stayed above freezing the whole time? That's what I'm telling you. Caleb shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief. In something closer to awe. I lost 2 horses, Emmett. Good ones. Jensen lost 5 cattle. Pritchard's lost everything. And you didn't lose a single animal. No, sir. Because you buried them. Because the earth don't freeze 8 feet down. Caleb stood quiet, staring at the ramp, the cabin, the horses grazing peacefully in snow up to their knees. Then he said, almost to himself, I called this a mistake. I told people you were trapping moisture. I was wrong. Emmett just nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't say I told you so. He went back to shoveling snow. But Caleb didn't leave. He asked questions. How deep did you dig? How wide are the ventilation shafts? How do you keep water from pooling? How much hay can you store down there? Does the roof leak when snow melts? Emmett answered every question, plain and factual. And when Caleb finally rode away 2 hours later, he carried something more valuable than livestock. He carried proof. By late January, word had spread. It wasn't Emmett who spread it. He wasn't the type to brag or advertise. It was Caleb and the Jensens, and a traveling preacher who'd stopped at 3 homesteads in a row and heard the same story. Emmett Graves didn't lose a single horse. People wanted to see for themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, a dozen homesteaders visited Emmett's place. They walked down the ramp. They touched the walls. They asked the same questions Caleb had asked, and Emmett gave the same answers, patient, methodical, like a man explaining how to sharpen an axe. Some were skeptical. One man, a carpenter from Iowa, insisted the setup was dangerous, claimed that without proper airflow, the horses would suffocate or succumb to manure gases. Emmett showed him the ventilation shafts, explained how he opened them during the day and partially closed them at night to retain warmth without trapping air. The carpenter walked away muttering, unconvinced. But 3 months later, that same carpenter started digging. Spring of 1887 brought the first imitators. A homesteader named William Tapper, 6 miles northeast of Emmett, excavated a similar barn, slightly smaller, only 6 feet deep instead of 8, but using the same principle. He built his cabin on top, ran ventilation through the floor, and by the following winter, his cattle survived a December cold snap that killed stock across 2 counties. By 1888, the idea had spread further. A rancher near the Niobrara River built a half-dugout barn into a hillside, combining earth shelter with a south-facing stone wall for solar gain. A family near the Dismal River dug a dual-purpose structure, half root cellar, half livestock shelter, and reported that their horses stayed healthier through winter than they ever had in a conventional barn. The adaptations varied, but the core principle remained: use the earth as insulation, not as an obstacle. County survey records from 1889 show at least 23 dugout or semi-subterranean barns within a 40-mile radius of Emmett's original homestead. Some were crude, simple pits with log roofs. Others were sophisticated, incorporating stone walls, drainage systems, and tiered floors for different animals. None of them were built because of government recommendation. None of them came from agricultural extension programs or university research. They spread the way all vernacular engineering spreads, one neighbor watching another survive, then copying what worked. By the early 1890s, the underground barn wasn't strange anymore. It was just another option. And in the hardest winters, 1893, 1899, it was often the best option. Caleb Rourke, the man who'd called Emmett's design a tomb, built his own version in the spring of 1890. He dug it 9 feet deep, used heavier timber for the roof beams, and added a second ramp for easier mucking. He never apologized to Emmett. Didn't need to. The act of building was apology enough. When Emmett saw it finished, he rode over, inspected the work, and said, "Looks solid." Caleb grinned. Figured if I'm going to copy a man, might as well copy him right. They shook hands. And that winter, when temperatures dropped to 30 below and the wind screamed across the sandhills for 10 straight days, both men's animals walked out alive. Here's what Emmett Graves understood that most people missed. You don't fight the land. You use it. The plains aren't forgiving. The wind doesn't negotiate. The cold doesn't care how hard you worked or how much lumber you bought. You can build the tallest barn, the thickest walls, the tightest roof, and winter will still find a way in. Or you can dig down. Let the earth do the work. Let thermal mass hold the line when the air temperature collapses. Let gravity drain water instead of fighting it. Let 8 feet of soil stand between your animals and a wind that can kill in minutes. It's not magic. It's physics. Soil has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Once the ground stabilizes at 50 degrees in autumn, it stays near that temperature all winter, buffered by sheer volume. Air, by contrast, has almost no thermal mass. It changes temperature instantly. A wooden barn filled with air is just a box of cold. A dugout barn surrounded by earth is a battery. Emmett didn't invent this principle. Indigenous peoples across the Great Plains had used earth-sheltered structures for centuries. Pit houses, earth lodges, semi-subterranean winter camps. The Pawnee built lodges with walls of packed earth and grass. The Hidatsa and Mandan used similar designs along the Missouri River, structures that stayed warm with minimal fire. Settlers, for the most part, ignore those lessons. They brought building traditions from the East, frame construction, vertical walls, wooden barns, and tried to force them onto a landscape that required different thinking. Most learned the hard way. Some, like Emmett, learned by watching the land itself. And the results were measurable. During the blizzard of January 1887, conventional wooden barns across the sandhills recorded internal temperatures near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Emmett's underground barn stayed at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of nearly 50 degrees with no additional heating. His horses consumed roughly the same amount of hay as they would in autumn. His neighbors' horses, shivering and burning energy just to stay alive, consumed double or triple that amount, and still died. Emmett's fuel cost for the entire winter? Essentially zero, beyond the firewood he used for his cabin stove. The residual heat bleeding down through the floorboards was a byproduct, not an expense. Compare that to a heated barn, rare in that era, but attempted by wealthier ranchers, which could burn a cord of wood per week just to keep temperatures above freezing. The math was brutal and simple. Earth insulation outperformed wood by every metric that mattered. But the lesson goes deeper than temperature. What Emmett built wasn't just a barn. It was a system, a way of thinking about shelter that prioritized resilience over appearance, function over convention. It was ugly by the standards of the day. It didn't look like a proper homestead. Visitors didn't admire it. But it worked when nothing else did. And that's the pattern you see again and again in vernacular engineering. The best solutions don't look impressive. They look obvious once you understand them. A corner stove that heats 2 rooms. A root cellar that keeps food cold without ice. A dugout barn that survives a blizzard without fire. These aren't primitive hacks. They're sophisticated responses to specific problems, refined over generations or discovered through necessity. They don't require expensive materials or advanced tools. They require observation, patience, and a willingness to look foolish until you're proven right. Emmett Graves died in 1903, 17 years after he built that barn. By then, his homestead had expanded. More land, a larger house, a proper above-ground barn for summer use. But the underground barn remained. His son used it through the 1910s. A neighbor bought the property in 1921 and kept using it until the late 1930s, when rural electrification and cheaper heating made it less necessary. The structure itself lasted over 50 years. The principle behind it is still valid today. Modern builders call it passive annual heat storage, PAS. Earthship architects use the same concept. Bury part of the structure, let the soil regulate temperature, minimize energy input. Root cellars, earth-bermed homes, and underground greenhouses all operate on the logic Emmett Graves applied in 1886. The technology hasn't changed. The physics haven't changed. What changes is whether people are willing to look past convention and ask, what does the land itself offer? Emmett never wrote a book, never gave a lecture, never claimed to be an innovator. He just dug a hole, put his horses in it, and trusted the ground to do what ground does. And when the worst winter in memory tried to kill everything above the surface, the things buried beneath survived. So here's my question for you. Which part of this solution would you apply to your own property today? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Because I guarantee someone in this community has lived through worse and survived with a trick you've never heard of. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.